They found me in the conservatory the morning after the announcement, standing among the white camellias with frost on the windowpanes. I had not slept. My hands, bare of gloves for the first time in weeks, rested against the cold glass as if I might press myself through it and disappear into the February garden. But I did not disappear. I had spent 32 years disappearing, and that morning something in me had calcified into permanence. The invitation lay on the hall table where my cousin had left it, cream vellum edged in silver, bearing the Ashworth crest. An engagement announcement. Lord Edmund Ashworth, my cousin by marriage, and the man who had courted me in careful, measured visits for 3 years, was to marry Miss Caroline Pemberton. The ceremony would take place in 6 weeks. I was invited to attend. I had believed, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has been told all her life to wait patiently, that Edmund's intentions toward me were sincere. He had taken tea in our parlour every Sunday. He had walked with me through the orchard in autumn, discussing poetry and the management of estates. He had asked my opinion on matters of consequence. And I, fool that I was, had mistaken attention for affection, conversation for courtship. My aunt found me there among the camellias. She did not embrace me. She rarely did. Instead, she adjusted her shawl and regarded me with the same cool appraisal she might give a piece of furniture that no longer suited the room. You must have known, Eleanor, that a man of his position would require more than companionship. Her voice carried the particular cruelty of truths spoken without malice. Miss Pemberton brings £20,000 and connections to 3 prominent families. What did you imagine you could offer in comparison? What indeed? I was the orphaned daughter of my aunt's late brother, raised in her household on sufferance, educated just enough to be acceptable in polite company, but not enough to be remarkable. I had no fortune, no influential relations, no beauty that turned heads in ballrooms. I had only my intellect, my careful observations, and a decade of making myself useful in a house that was not my home. I thought, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin as paper, that he valued my mind. My aunt's laugh was soft, dismissive. Men value many things in women, Eleanor. A fine mind is an ornament, nothing more. It does not secure futures or produce heirs. She moved towards the door, then paused. You will attend the wedding, of course. It would be unseemly not to. And you will be gracious. I would be gracious. I had been gracious my entire life. The years before that morning blur together now, a watercolour left too long in the rain. I remember my arrival at Ashworth Hall when I was 12, clutching a small trunk that contained everything I owned. My uncle had been kind in his distant way, but he died within 2 years, leaving me to my aunts, Charity. She was not cruel, precisely. She was practical. She fed me, clothed me, and introduced me into society as befitted my station, which is to say, barely. I became the eternal companion. The woman who played pianoforte tolerably well at evening gatherings, who read aloud to elderly relatives, who organised flowers and wrote correspondence and faded into wallpaper when more interesting guests arrived. I learned to make myself small, useful, invisible. When Edmund began his visits, I allowed myself to believe I had been seen at last. He would find me in the library and discuss the books I was reading. He asked about my opinions on politics, art, the modernisation of agriculture. We walked together, always properly chaperoned, but the conversations felt intimate, conspiratorial. He made me feel, for the first time in my life, that I possessed something of value beyond my ability to pour tea and nod sympathetically. I did not understand that I was being used. Edmund needed to appear thoughtful, educated, serious, qualities difficult to display when courting the empty-headed debutantes his mother paraded before him. I was his rehearsal, his proof to himself and others that he could engage with an intelligent woman. And when he had demonstrated this sufficiently, when the appropriate heiress appeared, he discarded me as easily as one might set aside a book one has finished reading. The humiliation was not public, which somehow made it worse. There had been no formal courtship, no broken engagement to draw sympathy or scandal. There was only the sudden absence of his visits, the appearance of Miss Pemberton at social gatherings on his arm, and the pitying glances from women who had always known I was reaching above my station. I discovered the full extent of my foolishness 2 weeks after the announcement. I was sorting through correspondence in my aunt's study, a task she found tedious and therefore delegated to me, when I came across a letter from Lady Ashworth to my aunt, dated 6 months prior. "I am relieved," Lady Ashworth had written, "that Edmund has found a suitable companion in your niece during this difficult period of indecision. Her conversation provides him excellent practice in appearing serious-minded, which will serve him well when courting women of consequence. You have my gratitude for her discretion." The letter continued, detailing Edmund's actual courtship of Miss Pemberton, a courtship that had been unfolding in London while he took tea with me in the countryside. My aunt had known. Everyone had known. I had been a performance, a practice run, a means to an end. And I had been so grateful for the attention that I had never questioned it. I set the letter down with hands that did not shake. Something in me had broken, yes, but something else was forming in its place, something cold and precise and patient. I thought of all the conversations Edmund and I had shared. He had been remarkably forthcoming about his concerns, his vulnerabilities, his fears about assuming his father's responsibilities. I knew things, and I had been taught, by years of invisibility, to observe. I began to pay attention differently. At gatherings, I positioned myself near doorways and in corners. I listened. I watched. I sorted through correspondence with new purpose. My aunt kept extensive files, and she was careless about what she left accessible to the niece she considered beneath notice. What I learned was this. Edmund Ashworth was not the thoughtful, serious man he presented to society. He gambled. Not extravagantly, but consistently, and with increasingly poor judgment. He owed money to several London establishments, debts his mother did not know about. The Pemberton match had been carefully orchestrated, not by love or even by strategic family alliance, but by Edmund's desperate need for Caroline's fortune to cover losses he could not afford to make public. There was more. Edmund had carried on a liaison with a married woman in London, the wife of one of his father's former business associates. The affair had ended badly. There had been threats, payments made for silence. These things were known in certain circles, but had been carefully contained. I spent 3 weeks gathering evidence. Not documents. I was not foolish enough to steal. But I memorised dates, names, amounts. I reconstructed timelines. I made careful note of who knew what and how they might be persuaded to speak of it. The engagement party was held at Ashworth Hall on a wet April evening. Rain sheeted against the windows of the ballroom, and 200 guests moved through rooms bright with candlelight and spring flowers. Caroline Pemberton looked radiant in cream silk, her hand resting possessively on Edmund's arm. My aunt had ensured I attended, placing me at a small table near the servants' entrance where women of uncertain status traditionally sat. the ageing maiden aunts, the poor relations, the companions. I wore a dress of dark blue velvet, high-necked and severe. I had inherited a small pearl necklace from my mother, one of the few possessions my aunt had not found a reason to appropriate. I wore it that evening. And I wore something else, Edmund's signet ring, which I had discovered in the library 3 years ago after one of our conversations. He had removed it while writing, forgotten it. I had kept it, meaning to return it. I never had. I waited until the toasts began. Edmund's father rose, his face florid with champagne and paternal pride, and spoke of his son's wisdom in choosing so accomplished a bride. Caroline's father responded, praising Edmund's character and bright future. Then Edmund himself stood, and the room fell silent. He began with the expected sentiments: gratitude, devotion, promises of happiness. He was eloquent. He had practiced, I thought, on me. I stood. The rustle of my dress in that momentary silence drew every eye. I walked slowly through the crowded ballroom, past the long tables laden with hothouse roses and champagne, toward the place where Edmund and Caroline stood beneath an arch of white lilies. My aunt's face drained of colour. I saw her mouth form my name, but no sound emerged. I stopped directly in front of Edmund. His expression shifted through confusion to recognition to something approaching fear. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "How kind of you to join the celebration." I reached into my reticule and withdrew his signet ring. I had polished it that afternoon until it shone. I held it up so that everyone near could see the Ashworth crest stamped into the gold. "You left this in my company 3 years ago," I said. My voice carried in the sudden silence. "I have been meaning to return it, but you stopped calling. I thought perhaps tonight would be appropriate, as you make promises to another woman, promises similar to those you once made to me." The room erupted into whispers. Edmund's face went pale, then red. "Miss Eleanor, you misunderstand." "I understand perfectly." I placed the ring on the table beside his champagne glass. "I understand that you spent 3 years seeking my company, my conversation, my counsel. That you wrote letters expressing your admiration for my mind and character. That you led me and others to believe your intentions were honourable." I turned slightly, addressing the room now. "I also understand that these courtships were conducted while you negotiated a match with Miss Pemberton, that you required my company to appear thoughtful and serious while managing debts from your gambling losses, that you used my conversation as practice for the performance you are delivering tonight." "This is absurd," Edmund said, but his voice wavered. "These are the delusions of a disappointed spinster." "I have letters," I said quietly. 17 of them, stored carefully in my possession. They document a courtship conducted in private while you publicly pursued another woman. They contain details of your financial difficulties, your fears about your father's reaction to your gambling debts, and your concerns about the persistence of certain rumours regarding your behaviour in London. You were remarkably forthcoming in your correspondence, Lord Ashworth. You trusted me. You believed, I think, that a woman of my station would never dare speak of such things publicly. The silence was absolute now. Caroline Pemberton had withdrawn her hand from Edmund's arm. Her father had risen from his seat, his face thunderous. "I kept your confidences for 3 years," I continued. "I said nothing when you ended your visits without explanation. I attended this gathering in silence, But I will not be dismissed as a delusional spinster while you pledge eternal devotion to another woman using the same words you once wrote to me. Edmund's mother had appeared at my elbow, her face a mask of fury barely contained by propriety. This is highly inappropriate, Miss Eleanor. You will leave immediately. I turned to her. I will leave when I have finished. You wrote to my aunt that you were grateful for my discretion, Lady Ashworth, that I provided your son with excellent practice in appearing serious-minded. You knew precisely what he was doing. You approved of it. And now you stand here expecting me to accept dismissal with grace while your son performs the same role he rehearsed with me for an audience that includes Miss Pemberton's family. I looked at Caroline then. She was younger than I had realised, not yet 20. Her face showed shock, confusion, and something else. A dawning recognition that perhaps she was not the first to be deceived. I wish you clarity, I told her softly, and I hope you receive better from this man than promises practised on disposable companions. I walked from that ballroom with my head high, through a sea of silence that followed me like a wake. Behind me, voices erupted, demands for explanation, accusations, denials. I heard Caroline's father calling for his daughter, his voice sharp with fury. I heard Lady Ashworth attempting damage control, her words clipped and imperious. I did not look back. My aunt caught up with me in the entrance hall, her face white with rage. You have destroyed yourself, she hissed. You will never be received in polite company again. You have ruined any chance of securing a respectable position. What do you imagine you have accomplished? I have told the truth, I said. For the first time in my life, I have said what everyone knew but refused to acknowledge. That is worth whatever consequences follow. The consequences were severe and swift. My aunt turned me out within the week. I was given a small allowance, enough to avoid scandal, not enough to live comfortably. I took rooms in Bath, a city where genteel poverty could be maintained with some dignity, where ageing women lived in quiet boarding houses and took daily constitutionals through the pump room. I thought the story would end there. I had achieved my revenge. Public humiliation for Edmund, exposure of his mother's complicity, the destruction of a marriage built on deception. Caroline Pemberton had broken the engagement within days. Edmund's gambling debts became public knowledge. His reputation, so carefully constructed, collapsed like wet pasteboard. But stories do not end with single dramatic moments. They ripple outward, changing everything they touch. I learned, through letters from women I had not realised were watching, that my exposure had effects beyond Edmund Ashworth. Caroline Pemberton's father had begun investigating the finances of potential suitors with new scrutiny. Other women, those who had been courted and then abandoned, those who had believed themselves at fault for failing to secure offers, began to speak more openly about the discrepancies between men's private assurances and public actions. I became notorious, yes. But I also became something else. Women wrote to me. Not many, but enough. They asked advice about courtships that felt uncertain. They shared suspicions about men who made promises in private but pulled away when families became involved. They wanted to know how to protect themselves, how to verify intentions, how to avoid becoming disposable rehearsals for other women's futures. I had never imagined myself as any kind of advocate. I had only wanted acknowledgement, recognition that I had been wronged, that my intelligence and time and hope were worth something, that I could not be used and discarded without consequence. But in the 3 years since that April evening, I have learned something. The women who write to me are not seeking permission for revenge. They are seeking permission to value themselves, to trust their observations, to demand clarity rather than accepting vague promises and patient waiting. Edmund married eventually, 2 years after the scandal. A quiet affair, a woman from a less prominent family who needed his title more than his character. I received no invitation. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he does not gamble anymore, that he has become careful, even timid, in society. That the confidence he once wore so easily has been replaced by something more guarded. I do not know if he thinks of me. I suspect he does sometimes when he looks at his signet ring and remembers the woman who returned it in a room full of witnesses. Caroline Pemberton never married. She travels extensively now, writes articles about her journeys, and has become rather scandalously independent. We exchanged letters once, years after the engagement party. She thanked me. She said that the humiliation of that evening had been a strange gift. It had shown her that the life she thought she wanted was built on performance and pretense, and she had decided to build something different instead. I do not know if what I did was right. I know it was necessary. I know that the spinster of Ashworth Hall, the invisible woman who poured tea and arranged flowers and listened politely, died the night she stood up in that ballroom and refused to disappear. I live quietly now. I am not welcomed in the drawing rooms I once frequented, but I have discovered I do not miss them. I have a small circle of friends, women who understand the particular violence of being useful until you are not, seen until you are inconvenient, valued until someone more valuable appears. I write sometimes, essays and observations that I send to small publications under assumed names. I read extensively. I correspond with women who find themselves in positions similar to mine, and I offer what I can, not solutions, but solidarity. Recognition that their experiences are real, their perceptions valid, their worth not determined by the men who fail to recognise it. On cold mornings, I still think about that February dawn in the conservatory, standing among the white camellias with frost on the windows. I remember the feeling of my hands against the glass, the desire to disappear. And I am grateful that I did not, that I chose instead to become visible in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed or explained away. I am not forgiven by polite society. I am not restored to my former position. But I am free in a way I never was when I was trying to be acceptable, trying to be chosen, trying to make myself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. They still call me the Spinster of Ashworth Hall. I have learned to wear the title like armour. I arrived at that engagement party with his signet ring. Yes. But I left with something more valuable. The knowledge that my voice, when I chose to use it, could not be silenced by propriety or convention or the quiet insistence that I should simply accept my dismissal with grace. I chose instead to make them remember me, and in doing so, I learned to remember myself. They found me in the conservatory that February morning, waiting to disappear, but I walked out of that ballroom 3 months later as someone who would never be invisible again.